Hi, Roger Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this day 19 of our coverage of the 2025 federal election. We're going to have David Coletto on the show today to break down his latest polling numbers. Looking forward to that. But let's first get you caught up to date on the last 24 hours of this campaign. So, where were the leaders and where are they headed? Mark Carney is back to Ottawa. He is convening his cabinet committee on Canada-U.S. relations at 10 a.m. this morning. Talk about the continuing fallout from Donald Trump's tariffs. Pierre Poilievre will be holding a press conference in St. Catharines. And then a big, rally, another one of those big rallies that he's been having near the Stellantis auto plant. Singh is in Ottawa at the Broadbent Institute giving a talk, and then he's got some media avails after that. So we'll continue to follow all the campaigns throughout the day on the Hub. Let's go to policy. We always like to talk a little bit about where the campaigns are at. And to be frank, we're kind of in the reannouncement phase. A lot of the policy has come out over the last 19 days. So Pierre Poilievre, coming out with more on housing, incentivizing municipalities to try to build more and lower the costs of those new home constructions. And Mark Carney indicating more support for the RCMP, gun buybacks, trying to show his crime agenda, at least as it relates to guns and violent deaths in Canada. There was not a significant NDP announcement in the last 24 hours. Well, let's bring in one of our favorite pollsters here on the program, David Coletto, and Sean Speer, my co-founder and editor-at-large. David, great to be in conversation with you on today, day 19.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me back.
Let's pull up onto the screen here your first kind of set of data that we're going to work through with you. This is the latest Abacus research, your company tracking this campaign carefully. And what we're seeing here is what, David? Impressions of Mark Carney continuing to widen out. It's kind of like a slow but steady climb to the top right of my screen, and a big gap here, David, with Pierre Poilievre.
Yeah, and I think this is one of for me, the interesting data stories of this election is that the longer this campaign goes on, it appears that Mark Carney's net favorables are improving, which is almost the opposite of what normally happens to any political leader who is at the center of the debate and one of the main choices to become prime minister. That there's very few elections I can think of, both federally or provincially, in which this happens. And so there's an indication that the more that Canadians are seeing Mark Carney, the more they're liking him, and that the Conservative campaign and the New Democrat campaign and the Bloc campaign have done very little to bring him kind of back to earth, right? And to find yourself at almost plus 20 halfway through this campaign, I think is a credit to the Liberal campaign and maybe a little discredit to his opponents because this is a big part of the story.
Yeah, Sean,
it's not just that Mark Carney is pulling people to the Liberals as much as anything else right now.
Sean, let me come to you because Mark Carney is back in Ottawa today. He is back at, in a sense, being prime minister in full. He is convening this cabinet committee for Canada-U.S. relations, seemingly out of the blue. I don't really understand what the specific issue is, Sean. I'm trying to be as charitable as possible here. We have no new sanctions. In fact, Canada's had a pretty good week the last week in terms of dodging the latest chaos out of Washington. What do you make about today's decision by the Carney campaign as to where their candidate is and what he's doing?
Yeah, one of the most insightful comments we've heard over this campaign on our daily show, something that I think has become, in a way, a sort of thesis for a lot of our analysis, is that governing is campaigning for Mark Carney. It enables him to lean into a lot of his strongest attributes, the sense that he's a steady hand, that he's competent, that he's in control. And it also, of course, reminds Canadians about the issue that they want this election ultimately turn on, which is Donald Trump and who's best to lead Canada vis-a-vis the Trump administration. So in that sense, guys, normally we think of campaigns of leaders going out and offering different types of policy proposals, trying to target different demographic groups and all the rest. In some ways, being prime minister is at the center of the Liberal campaign strategy. As David says, it's working very well. And so as we go into the back half of this campaign, one can, I think, anticipate, Roger, that they're going to manufacture these instances where they can go back to what's working for them, which is him wearing a necktie, a jacket, and acting and being the Prime Minister of Canada.
Yeah. David, let's look at another set of data from your latest poll. These are impressions of Pierre Poilievre, and it's literally the mirror image, the opposite kind of story, David, than what Mark Carney has seen over the campaign.
Yeah, and I think, it's not that Mr. Poilievre has the worst numbers I've ever seen. In fact, they're not that bad for him, and it doesn't fit the narrative that he's a deeply unpopular political leader in which everyone's running away from. But compared to Mark Carney, he is not as popular, right? At 38% positive, that's a big 10-point gap between the two. And there's more negativity and significantly more intense negatives, right? And that I think is a challenge for any conservative leader, frankly, and is helped driving some New Democrats and Bloc supporters into the Liberals' arms. But I still don't look at this and say, Pierre Poilievre is in deep trouble, because even when Stephen Harper was winning majorities, majority of the country wasn't in love with him. When Aaron O'Toole was in the midst at some point in the last campaign to maybe being able to pull off that win, he wasn't seeing a net favorable rating. And so these are kind of normal numbers for a conservative. The problem is this is not a normal election, and these numbers aren't enough right now in order to win a majority for the Conservatives.
David, if I can take the conversation in a slightly different direction, one of the reasons we love having you on is you do top line polling, but you also combine data with really thoughtful analysis. And one subject you've leaned into in the past several days is what's going on with boys and men. Do you want to just reflect on the gender dynamic in this race and frankly, some of the bigger gender issues at the backdrop of the campaign itself?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a gender gap, generally speaking, for a while now. It's closed a little bit because the Liberal vote is getting to a point now where even men, for the most part, are basically split between voting Liberal and Conservative. But, CBC did this kind of in-depth investigation into what's happening with younger men. And I've been personally interested in that because I've seen in my data really a divergence, a really wide divergence between where young men are going and where young women are going, both politically, but also in their broader attitudes and values. And what we're seeing right now, just on political behavior or intended political behavior, is young men are still firmly in the Conservative camp and young women are firmly not. And the gap between them, if you're under 30, and you're male or female, the gender gap is the widest it is among any of those age groups. If you look at gender, right? Men over 60 are almost as likely to vote the same way as women over 60. So something's happening, I think. And I've always been really fascinated by the fact that headed into this campaign, young people generally, but particularly young men, had a very good understanding who the leader of the opposition was. That's not normal, right? Like Aaron O'Toole, Andrew Scheer, these were not household names before the election started. Young Canadians did not really know who they were. But I think Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives did a very good job at introducing himself and reintroducing himself and building a relationship with young men that I think is sustaining itself. As everybody else might be leaving, or not leaving the Conservatives, but certain demographics rallying around the Liberals, young men have resisted that. And I think it's because they're actually attracted to the narrative that Poilievre is giving, which is things aren't great. And, no amount of the same solutions for the last 4 years are going to make it any better. And they're looking for a disruptor, not stability, frankly.
Mm-hmm. David, just finally, got to take a look at this last finding in your most recent poll, because it is a shocker. Who do you credit more for the carbon tax removal? 55% of Canadians credit Mark Carney and the Liberal government for making the change, 28% for Pierre Poilievre. I mean, this literally, David smacked me upside the head when I saw this morning. So one of the kind of signature, I don't know, signature political efforts, motifs, thrusts of this of Pierre Poilievre and his stewardship of the Conservative Party has now been effectively hijacked in the public imagination by the Liberal Party and Mark Carney.
Yeah, and I actually didn't know what we were going to find when I asked this question. I was actually genuinely interested, right? Because I think anyone watching this carefully would not have given Mark Carney more of the credit than Pierre Poilievre, who has spent
by 2-1, David. By 2-1.
Most of the time as leader fighting this one policy and was very successful in seeing it end. Maybe not because he did it, but somebody else did. But there's more to this than this specific data point. What's fascinating is, one, in those provinces that saw the federal backstop lift, they were well aware their gas prices dropped. So it shows just how sensitive that metric is to people, and they're watching it carefully. And we asked a follow-up open-ended question, why do you think the price of gas dropped? And almost everybody pointed to the carbon tax removal. So to me, this is like a stroke of brilliance on the part of the Liberal campaign, because it was a deeply engaging issue at a time when the cost of living is still very salient, and the Liberals were trailing the Conservatives on that. Here comes Mark Carney along, and in the middle of a political campaign, helped deliver a few bucks savings every time you fill up, and people knew it, and they're now giving him credit for it. So, carbon tax Carney is a label he's probably not going to run away from, because he can go around and say, look what I did.
Sean, and to think, Sean, that the coup de grace is still to come. These are the checks. The checks, Sean. Why don't you remind us about these checks that will now fall in the final week of the campaign? I mean, this is too much.
Yeah.
Too much.
Yeah, when the Carney government repealed the carbon tax, they preserved the final rebate checks to go out, which should hit people's bank accounts in the coming days, just as they're preparing to vote. Which maybe is a good segue to a final question for David. We have debates next week. I think a lot of Conservatives at this stage are hanging their hopes on something coming out of the debates that destabilizes or disrupts the numbers that you've shared with us today. What are you going to be looking for in the next few days or the next week or so to assess whether this trend is really codified or whether there's an opening for the Conservatives to try to move the needle?
I'm watching because I still think there is an opening. I don't think this is over yet. I think the debates could be important. They always could be. But in this case, the indicators from our surveys are that people are intending to tune into this, right? Like 58% of Canadians say they intend to watch or at least pay attention to the leaders' debate. Now, they may not all watch it, and everyone can say it and not do it. But we know the level of interest in this campaign is higher than the last two. And the last point is, more people expect Mark Carney to do well in that English debate than they do Pierre Poilievre. So I actually think the bar is going to be quite high for Carney in the English debate, where it won't be in the French one. And that means people are going to be tuning in to say, is how I feel about him. Because it's a feeling that he's competent, that he's got experience, that there's a clarity in his purpose, and he's going to guide this country in a certain direction. Does he validate that in the debate? And I think it is a moment for all the leaders, but particularly Pierre Poilievre, to not only make the case that Carney's not who he says he is or who you believe he is, but I think Poilievre is also going to have to counter that with, I am also not who you think I am, to a large group of voters that right now aren't thinking about the Conservatives. Lastly, Jagmeet Singh, if the Conservatives are going to win, Jagmeet Singh also have to have a good night on that debate stage and try to bring home some of those New Democrats, because I just don't see a path for the Conservatives as long as the NDP is polling at 10% or below.
Yeah. Well, David, always fascinating to have your analysis and insights. We'll be talking again, no doubt, in the week to come. Have a terrific long weekend.
Have a great weekend, guys.
Yeah.
Thank you. You too.
Hey, Sean. We are seeing some shifts here that have got to be tough for the Conservative campaign to internalize. Things like Carney pulling ahead on the carbon tax, or this popularity gap
Yeah.
opening up even wider. Mark Carney not being blunted, and the tracking polls, day to day, showing that the Liberals are, maintaining and sometimes extending in some polls their lead over the Conservatives.
Yeah, I was in the campaign war room for the Conservatives in 2015, and it was about this time in the election, Roger, where the numbers started to move in a direction, and they didn't come back, and that made that last couple of weeks of the campaign pretty grim. The energy in the war room was down. The energy on the campaign trail, the momentum started to dissipate. It really it kind of permeated the campaign. I do think that is a question for the Conservatives. They've had these big numbers on the ground, of course, over the past few weeks. Notable, the biggest we've seen in Canadian politics in my lifetime. It'll be interesting to see the extent to which even conservative voters themselves, Rudyard, are seeing these numbers, and in so doing, losing some of the energy and momentum that we've seen. That's particularly notable because, as David said, the Conservatives are over-indexed, if I can put it that way, with younger voters who generally have a lower propensity to vote. And so, if they feel like this race is over, one wonders if that results in turnout, not a limited turnout amongst that cohort, which could kind of reinforce the kind of the negative trends that we're watching.
Yeah. Well, stay right there, Sean. As part of the Hub's commitment to covering Western Canadian views on this election, we sure think that is important. A real pleasure to have back onto the program from Vancouver, James Moore, former federal cabinet minister with the Conservatives and senior advisor to Edelman. James, thoughts here? Where are we at on day 19? It looks like a critical week coming up leading into the leaders' debate. And then I guess the Easter weekend when people will sit down, families will gather, and I think opinions surely will start to harden.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, there's 3.5 weeks left thereabouts, but there's really not, right? We've got the leaders' debates coming up next week, French, English, on Thursday night, and then Good Friday, Easter weekend, where people will sit around and start slicing up the ham and looking at their family members and saying, "Oh, so the election? Are you gonna? I'm gonna vote. Are you gonna vote? Who do you like? I mean, usually I vote. Are you gonna? How are you gonna?" And that conversation is gonna happen, and then it'll crystallize, and then that's it. And then people will start pulling out their phones and putting into their Google calendars. Oh yeah, it's on the 28th. I think I've got a thing with the thing, but yeah, after work, I'll and all that. So I think it crystallizes really fast. And the friends that I know and who are out there campaigning and door knocking now, what they're finding is the undecideds are disappearing really fast. It's true we have a short election campaign, but we have saturation coverage, and everybody gets news alerts on their phones. And Donald Trump does something. China. I was going to bed late last night. It was about 1 a.m. or so, and getting the news alerts that China was counterpunching, and all, like we're getting inundated constantly with the big question of the big topic of the moment, and we're all up to date. We see with our eyes, we in HD and a little screen right in our hands. We can look really closely at who our choices are, Carney and Poilievre, and we know what the choices are, and we can vote. And so it's frustrating for a campaign because you have all this infrastructure and effort, but voters have the capacity to draw in information and the touch points that they care about and make choices real quick.
The Carney campaign has been hyper disciplined, James, but this week it had one of its rare missteps, and that was on the Israel-Hamas question. I was talking to some well-placed liberals in Ottawa this week who intimated that this created a lot of discord in the war room, in some of the different campaigns. In a way, I think it spoke to something deeper, that inherent challenges in managing a pretty broad and diverse coalition that Mr. Carney currently represents. Why don't you just reflect on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's not surprising. And you look at the swing ridings and where they are in the country, where, the Jewish community is prominent and engaged and really, focused on that question and the sensitivities around it. Frankly, same thing with the Ukrainian community as well. You can imagine if somebody misspeaks on that, it's about 15% thereabouts of the population of Saskatchewan and Manitoba of Ukrainian lineage, about 10% in Alberta as well. and bombed out hospitals and the horrible images there and the bullying of Vladimir Zelensky in the White House. And for a lot of Canadians, that's a family affair. That's and it's so too is it true with the Jewish community as well. This is very near and dear. And to have Prime Minister Netanyahu through social media engaging in the election campaign, chastising the incumbent prime minister of the country, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. And so I think Liberals are right to be nervous. And Mark Carney is not sort of nuanced in the subtleties of language and the subtleties of emphasis. So when he struggles in the second language in French, that's among the reasons why, the French language leaders debate is going to be really important. Even though he's getting a bit of a pass from a bunch of people in Quebec, there are still 2.5 million French-speaking Canadians outside of Quebec, and so the subtleties of languages, the nuances, people know what they see and they know what's being said, they know what's not being said, and what that means and what you're couching and hiding and how you're being cute, and it's that's why politics is so like we're so quick to Monday morning quarterback all the leaders. But man, this is a tough job. Like I was watching Pierre Poilievre the other day at the Edmonton rally, and of course, the one at Sault Ste. Marie after that. And it's just like, we expect so much of our leaders to have high EQ, high IQ, to be thoughtful on public opinion, to be culturally relevant, to look good, to present a certain way, to know how to speak to a camera, speak to a crowd, do crowd work, be thoughtful, have a line, have a comeback, understand technology and all that. Oh, and by the way, can you do that in 2 languages? If you have a third, that'd be great too. It's just like the expectations that we have for our leaders is really astonishing. And Mark Carney's learning about the risks of that.
Yeah. Mark Carney is in Ottawa today. James, you've sat around that cabinet table before. What do you think of the strategy? And what do you think of this idea that he is taking some pretty liberal license with this concept called the Caretaker Convention, that when you are in a campaign, the civil service, the clerk of the Privy Council, other senior bureaucrats really should be leading the government, should be, in a sense, in caretaker mode. It certainly doesn't feel that way, James, for the last 19 days.
Yeah, I mean, I remember in the '08 economic crisis, Jim Flaherty pulled himself from the election campaign, but he did that once, and it was Jim Flaherty. And this idea that he's suspending the campaign for a third time in 3 weeks. Come on now. If you do it fourth in 4 weeks, and it gets a little suspicious. And the idea is, we're suspending the campaign. We'll say, you're suspending and shifting your movements. I think the ads are still running. I think the signs are still up. I think all that stuff is still happening. So what exactly is being suspended here in the principle of sort of good faith governing of the country? So I mean, I can't say that Conservatives would necessarily do something profoundly different. But again, Mark Carney, who not only isn't elected into the post that he has, he's never sought office before. He's never received a single vote from a Canadian in an electoral process. And I don't know that there was anything sort of crisis measuring in the last 72 hours that warrants the hear ye. I'm suspending my campaign. I'm being noble and putting the country pump the brakes a little bit on the thing. So I don't think he'll get away with it a fourth time. The media is giving him a pass, and Donald Trump is being sufficiently all over the map in terms of his thinking and doings of things that I think the public is giving him a bit of a pass. But I made my point.
James, today the Poilievre campaign essentially packaged together some of its signature policy measures in what it's characterizing as an economic action plan. We can talk a bit about the branding and all the rest, but what's significant to me is it signals that the campaign is essentially done rolling out new and incremental policy, that this is it. This amounts to the plan that the party is putting to Canadians. With 2 or 3 weeks to go, someone who's running a lot of campaigns, what do you do when you've kind of exhausted your policy announcements? How does that influence the way that you campaign and the types of events or messages that you're advancing?
I'm guessing that they're going to use the last sort of final push to really emphasize the negatives on Mark Carney. They've got to drive his negatives down. You saw the Abacus data that I did, that Mark Carney's positives are, he's still a net positive in key regions of the country. So I think there's that. But I do think there's a finishing argument, because the ballot question hasn't changed in the sense that Donald Trump is this existential force that's a threat to the security and economic sovereignty and all that of Canada. That hasn't changed. What might have changed, in part because of the 90-day pause, in part because, which doesn't apply to Canada, but the dynamic, but and also because Donald Trump seems to be changing and unreliable, and he seems to not hold a steady thought for more than a quarter of a day. That all of that means that we don't maybe necessarily need a crisis manager, which has sort of been the Carney pitch in the early part of the campaign, but maybe we do need to back up and sort of think about who do we need for the next 10 years, right? And say, how do we have somebody who's got the stamina, the parliamentary experience, and all that, and a broad-based level of support across the country to sort of reframe the country and to make us more bulletproof compared to the Trump threats. And so I think that's probably the closing pitch. A negative pushback against Mark Carney, which we haven't seen yet, and he's accumulated some damage, as we just talked about a second ago with Israel. His insufficiency in French by historic standards and a few other things, and I think there's a closing pitch that Pierre can make that is really that I think is really quite compelling.
Last question, James. Got to bring it back to British Columbia, where you are now. How's BC looking to you? I mean, it's a complicated at best electoral map with traditionally all three parties performing in the province in different locations in different ways. What are you seeing this time that might be different?
I think Conservatives add seats for sure. I'm not sure exactly where they will. That there could be, depending on how the numbers are, there could be a bit of a switch here and there. The wealthier parts of the suburbs of Vancouver, which are sort of a liberal conservative two-way fight, if the polls are be to believe, might make it more accretive to liberals. But other parts of the country, like British Columbia, is one of those places where historically, back in the 90s, there was this mysterious creature who voted Reform federally but NDP provincially, and we knew they existed, statistically, but we didn't quite know what their names were. Now those people are actually walking around, living, breathing, thoughtful people who are out there, and you can see them all the time. These are private sector union guys and men and women who care about crime, who believe in the right to bargain collectively, who worry about their pensions, but they also want to make sure that their houses are safe, that criminals are held accountable, that we're not tilting too far on social stuff and social experimentation, and they're really uncomfortable with immigration beyond capacity and what that means for schools and what it means for social integration and the ability for us to have a congenial society. Like those voters have left the NDP and they've found a perfect home in the Conservative Party. Yeah. So some places like the West Kootenays up north, out in Prince George, Skeena, Prince Rupert, Nanaimo, Port Hardy, those parts of the province that are working collar, blue collar people, they've flocked very much so to the Conservative Party, and they don't have much interest in the Liberals. So it'll be a redrawn map net in terms of seats. I don't know, but I think the Conservative Party will do well in British Columbia.
Wow. James Moore, thank you so much for coming on the program today. Your analysis and insights always on point, and we really appreciate it here at the Hub.
Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you for keeping up the grind. It's an important campaign, and what you're doing is really thoughtful and well done.
Well, we appreciate you being along for the ride.
Thank you.
Well, Sean, that's going to be a wrap for today's show. So what we're going to do now is say goodbye to our viewers and listeners who are listening or watching to the show on demand on YouTube or their favorite podcast app. And then hello in a moment to all the people who've been part of the live chat. These shows, if you are listening or watching on demand, do kick off live every day at 10 a.m. Eastern. And you can be part of the chat and have your questions answered by Sean and me at the end of each program. So here's that bye-bye and then a hello to our live chat listeners. So bye-bye, everyone.